So it's so good to have you here, Azim, today in Cambridge. I was wondering the other day, when was the first time we met?
We met in 2012 in Dubai.
That's right. I always like to go back to that story
Yep.
because, I wanted to run I really knew nothing about how to run a psychological experiment. Before I met you and Jean-François.
I was the only psychologist for miles.
That's right. And actually, it's funny, we went into that office in a self-driving car.
That's right. Yeah, self-driving car. It was magnets on the ground.
In quotes, because it was like a little pod that was kind of still experimental.
Yeah.
It was, I think, a Dutch company that made these things, and that's how I went to work every day. It was I would park the car at the outskirts of this zero carbon city, and then I would take a little self-driving pod that kind of fits 4 people.
Yeah.
But I think it's kind of poetic that this is how we met,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
So here we are, doing research about how people perceive those self-driving cars and how people ascribe, moral status to them, or and how would they want them to behave in morally charged situations, like the trolley problem type situation, where the car would be faced with a choice between swerving and maybe killing its own occupant, or continuing on and killing some pedestrians. So this whole body of work that we ended up doing is about kind of the moral behavior that we would want to endow a machine with. But I always was wondering whether the machine becomes the enforcer of morality rather than the executor of the morality. So this is something that you yourself studied extensively and continue to study, actually, that for instance, the way that humans regulate their own moral behavior very much depends on having an enforcer or having belief in an enforcer. And you have your most cited paper, which led you to having more citations than me, is God is watching you.
Yeah.
And this paper is about how when people think of an omniscient God, that then they feel watched, they feel observed, and this increased observability makes them more moral in their choices.
Yeah.
So I always wondered, in a world where machines start literally observing us. It's not us believing that there is an entity in the sky that is watching us, but the machines are actually observing us and our behavior because we carry them in our pockets and as smartphones, and they they can track our movements, they can track our communication with others. They have pictures of us doing things, and they know a lot about us. So does this, in your opinion, act as a similar force of observability that regulates our behavior? Or is it fundamentally different because it's more literal and we can verify that this observation is taking place?
Yeah, so great question. So I think it's worth taking a step back to explain how the God idea works, right? So because humans are so dependent on the social group, they have a very sensitive system to protecting their own reputation. Because it's very important to have a good reputation, to be able to be a good cooperator in a group, to have other people cooperate with you. And so we've evolved to be very sensitive to these cues of being watched. The problem is that once you get in large groups, you start losing the ability to keep track of everybody's reputations. And so people can be anonymous. And so the invention of not only the idea of God, but in particular this type of omniscient, all-powerful, punishing God, was a way that allowed people no longer to be anonymous. And if they're no longer anonymous, then they no longer have the temptations to act in ways that they would if they can hide from all observers. That is, in ways where they're cheating and being tempted and free riding on the group and doing all these things, which makes them bad members of the group and ultimately compromises the harmonious function of the group. And so the reason it was effective in that time to have this belief in this immaterial God that didn't actually exist was because we did not have the ability to actually watch people at all times in all moments. One of the things we've seen since that time, so you could put this time at somewhere around 5,000 years to the current day, but we've started to see some replacements. So once you had a powerful centralized government, you could have a police force and a police force attached to a whole justice system that was able to have enough eyes on the ground and enough of a justice system to actually keep laws that would allow a civilization to be harmonious in and of itself. Now that transition to this idea of the machine, we see this in increased use of cameras. Mm-hmm. And so the big example is all the cameras that were put up in London. Mm-hmm. And the question is, does this work? And it doesn't seem to work as much as you would expect it to. It doesn't seem to work as much as the feeling of always being watched should. And the reason for that is because we become desensitized to it. And this actually happens in the God stuff as well. So the way we test for the effect of God on morality or on pro-social behavior is in a moment we activate in one's head the idea of God. And that taps into this idea of being watched. And so people then get on their best behavior for a while, but then it wears off and they revert back to that way where they actually engage in it.
Which is why, a lot of religions have mechanisms for constant reminders.
That's right.
Like
you have
Islam,
to keep
for example,
re-upping it.
You have to pray 5 times.
Exactly.
So you're being reminded 5 times a day of what, that you are being watched. And
you have the call to prayer blare across the whole city in a way that you
right.
can't ignore it, and everybody remembers it. And at that moment, in fact, they've done experiments just like this, that when the call to prayer is going, people act more generously. And then you see moments after it stops, you could see that effect diminish until it comes back again the next time the call to prayer goes up. So it's an ephemeral effect. And
do you think it's like the frequency in that case is kind of optimized for the decay in this effect?
Well, it's costly. It's costly to have that level like 5 times a day, the interruptions to work, the interruptions to sleep.
But not every religion has the 5 times a day.
No,
there are different frequencies, and I'm just
right. So I'm saying there's a trade-off there, right? It's like, so you could have it 10 times a day, 20 times a day, but you wouldn't be able to get anything else done. And so there's a cost to going too far with it. Now, maybe there's not a cost to having the cameras everywhere in very visible ways, but what we've seen is that people eventually forget that the cameras are there, in the same way that when police officers wear body cameras, they get on their best behavior for a bit, and then they kind of go back to how they were anyways, as they forget that they're there. In the same way that I think everybody recognizes that their internet searching or whatever they do is always visible in this day and age. I mean, everything, we've seen many, many sci-fi movies or TV shows about this idea that we're always being recorded now. We're no longer anonymous. We no longer have those corners where we can hide, and yet people still do really crappy things.
So is what you're saying somehow, does it imply that then that you cannot dispense yet with the idea of God because it still has a function in regulating behavior because precisely of this desensitization? Well,
no, I don't think so. So because God is not a perfect system either, right? Because you get desensitized to the idea that God is watching you as well. So you could either re-up the idea of God, or you could remind people, oh, remember you're being watched, right? So if on your computer screen every 5 minutes, remember you're being watched, yes. It jumped out at you, then you probably would act differently. Now, the one exception I can possibly think of, and I don't know enough about this, but is sort of the Soviet police state or the kind of East German police state after the war. Right? There's a situation where people would rat out their neighbors for any disloyal activities, and it seemed like that was sufficient to get people in line.
But that it is generally agreed upon nowadays that this was too far. This was maybe
terrible, yeah.
This was excessively regulating. That there is such a thing as excessive regulation of behavior, because then it can be it can lead to very universalistic sort of sense of what's right and wrong, that one group decides what's right and what's wrong, and then everybody has to comply, which seems to be something that we don't like. We like this kind of multiplicity of moralities that compete in a kind of an evolutionary race.
Yeah, which brings up another reason why this scenario that you painted about this all-seeing AI could be quite dystopic. And again, that's something that's visited in a lot of movies and sci-fi television shows.
So I guess kind of a related question though is then whether God and let's say the NSA or the possibility of your private communications becoming public somehow or whatever, or your private pictures becoming public, like do you see these as complements or substitutes, to use the language from economists? Does introducing the idea that all of your behavior and movements and communication is observed and recorded for eternity in some bunker somewhere in a server, does that substitute, does it kind of displace faith in the omniscient God, or does it actually improve its capacity? Do they work together to make for an even more effective regulatory system?
Yeah, I don't think it can be a substitute because there's one big difference, right? And the big difference is that the idea of this omniscient God needs to be, I don't know if it needs to be, but it seems most effective when it's paired with other aspects of religion. And one of them is this idea of an infallible God that you believe to be absolutely right, which you don't believe about the NSA, right? So one of the other aspects that relates morality to religion is that what is deemed right is what God says. There's a divine commandment theory, and you trust God ultimately because you also trust that he has your best interests at heart, or his best interests at heart, which involve loving you and all this kind of stuff. But the big point is that God is an absolute authority for morality, and so when he is watching and judging you, it's less problematic because he's guiding you to the right path or punishing you from deviating from the right path. And so it seems like a fairer person who's watching and punishing you for that. Whereas you can't say the same thing about the NSA. It doesn't have that sort of ultimate moral authority. It could have like ultimate secular, practical authority, but it doesn't have the ultimate moral authority that a God has.
So this makes me wonder then that say that we do move to a world in which this sort of observability by algorithms and machines and devices and sensors becomes even more and more effective and better at kind of characterizing not just your behavior, but perhaps even your intent, right? Which is something that that God is supposed to be able to do as well, because so many actions
in some religions,
right? So that the God judges in some of these religions judges the action by intent as well as by outcomes. And this is something that machines could also become presumably better at. So my question, I guess, now is, God as the ultimate moral authority. This is something that has been shaped by these rules or these commandments and these kind of principles come from a kind of an evolutionary process in which these particular commandments and these particular ideals are somehow helpful for society because they embody things that work, they have historically worked, and there's a kind of evolutionary process that selects for them. And I wonder if with machines sort of deciding who's at fault and deciding kind of when to trigger an alarm for a moral violation that is excessive or whatnot, whether we would literally arrive at the same things.
And when I thought you were going with that, right? So the cultural evolutionary process by which we arrived at a set of moral rules that are enforced by religions, which believers don't perceive them to be enforced for that reason. They think that they are the right reasons because that's what God wants, but the actual ultimate reason is that, they were selected for through this 1,000-year process of trial and error.
According to the evolutionary theory of religion.
Cultural evolutionary theory. You're suggesting that level of intelligence that cultural evolution has can be matched by or exceeded potentially by the artificial intelligence.
Well, or that literally the same selection force would act on the kinds of algorithms that regulate our behavior. So for instance, we in many religions there are different grades of moral violations. Some grades of moral violations would lead to, very severe punishments. Others are left sort of to the discretion of the individual, and the punishment for them is something in the afterlife, or you have some kind of bad deeds that sort of count somehow. So it's not as if there's no intervention from the state or from the enforcers of moral principles. And do you think that and these distinctions, I imagine, are helpful because these things, some behaviors impinge on others, some don't, some kind of more a reflection of your own character. And do you think that these kind of forces would shape machines in policing us in the same way? Because one can argue that today, a lot of our internet-based systems, social media, even though these things are not yet automated, but there's sometimes there is excessive punishment of moral violations. Somebody would say something that is then misconstrued as offensive, and so on.
Their lives are ruined.
And then lives are ruined, people lose their jobs and so on. And you could, so do you imagine that, a similar system of distinction, that kind of leads, will also be learned by a machine that is trying to further our success?
To further our success, that's exactly the key point, right? Is like it depends on what it's being selected for, right? So cultural evolution selected for a certain thing, which was the survival and thriving of the group, which is basically its ability to outcompete other groups. And so so long as it's able to do that, that was something which was selected and that deemed moral. It wasn't deemed moral, it was like, that's adaptive, culturally adaptive. So is the criteria that the AI is going to be selecting on, is it also going to be that idea of just cultural adaptiveness, or are the goals that we put in there going to be involving other things like human freedom, like individual freedom? Are those going to also be goals which are competing with or in combination with the idea of just a thriving society that can outcompete other societies? If so, then different moral ideas are going to be picked, and different punishments are going to be involved.
And I guess this is already happening because there are, for example, some in Europe, for instance, there are very different sensibilities or kind of tendencies about managing privacy and the kind of the right of companies to use people's data for profit, including algorithmic targeting of advertising and things like this. In the US, I would say there's less concern about these things because it's kind of a more free market mentality. And there's also different cultures, like in some Eastern countries are getting into systems where there's more let's say there's the social credit, for example, and things that reflect people's reputations online through their transactions becoming even kind of movable across domains, right? And I guess only time will tell. Is that what you're saying? That only time will tell which ones of these are in the spectrum between a kind of a Soviet police state and a kind of an anarchy. What wins? What would work and what wins? You're saying the same sort of evolutionary competition is going to play out in an AI regulated world.
Well, I wasn't saying that, but that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I guess what I was saying is that it depends what criteria of maximization that you're trying to get the AI to maximize, right? So it's like,
but if it's competition with other groups,
if it is, so when it becomes competition with other groups, then whichever one seems to be able to outcompete all the other groups on the dimensions that matter is going to select for the AI that's best able to accomplish that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's possible that you could just get the AIs to fight in some virtual world until they figure it out, and then we all do that tomorrow. Yeah.
I mean, that would be an interesting movie too.
Yes, I think I've seen that movie.
So, but then there's something that's being unsaid here, which is that the AI is going to an AI that observes and exacts punishment. Is it more similar to we've made the analogy with the idea of God, but we could have also made the analogy with the idea of the state. Yeah. So the idea of the state, and this is something that Thomas Hobbes brought up, which is that the state extracts its legitimacy not from a divine sovereign, or a sovereign that has divine right or has been selected, is representative of God on earth, but through the mutual consent of the people. We could have used that metaphor for AIs, that we kind of collectively program the AIs that then observe and police our society. And in a sense, it's kind of what bureaucracies do, the government bureaucracies do. And I think increasingly, these same bureaucracies are actually using algorithms, and they're kind of turning into cyborg sort of states in a way, because they're using machine learning to improve policies and to decide on all various things to do with the function of governance.
Yeah, but at what point does it become AI controlled by a bureaucracy versus the bureaucracy controlled by the AI? And maybe that's the point where the AI becomes more godly than stately.
But I think it is. I agree, and I think it could become also more godly in a symbolic sense. And this is where my question is that if we just think of it as a secular implementation of our general will, to use the terms from Rousseau, right? That's one way of looking at it. But some people, like for example, Lewandowski, who's a ex-Waymo kind of person who builds driverless cars, he's actually starting a kind of religion built on an AI godhead. Yeah. And and I think so these seem to be kind of fundamentally different in that if you think of AI as simply a government that is created by mutual consent, but it's just it uses algorithms rather than people to function. That's a secular idea. But if you think of an AI godhead, then that's a decidedly spiritual idea. And do you think there is a reason for having the religious symbolism ascribed to this entity, and whether because these symbols did have a function as well?
Yeah. I mean, it depends on what your goal is, right? So certainly, if you can get people to believe in an AI in the way that they believed in a God, insofar as it's connected to, first of all, supernatural power that can't be questioned. So then the decisions to follow what the AI wants are not simply a sort of a consequentialist cost-benefit analysis saying, well, if I don't follow this, then I'm likely to get this much punishment, but if I can avoid this, and maybe that much punishment is bearable if it allows me to do this. That's a cost-benefit analysis, which makes sense insofar as you have a secular sense of judgment. What happens in religions is that you have sacred rules which you don't violate for any amount of benefit at all. So you can look at an example with dietary taboos, right? So one way to stop people from eating, say, shellfish or pork is to say, well, look, there are costs to the group if you do this. So look, some animal might have a higher percentage chance of carrying some sort of disease, and that disease might spread to the group if you were to eat it, and so it increases the risk to the group by this much, and so we say, don't eat it. And then you're starving, and that's all you have to eat. And you think, well, look, it's worth it. It's worth it to increase this risk, so I'm going to do that. I know what the punch might be, but in this case, I'm pretty dangerous. So you kind of make the cost-benefit analysis. If you say, on the other hand, that you don't eat this because it is against the will of God and against your religion that your entire identity is tied to, well, then you don't even question it. You say, I would rather starve. There's no price worth paying to violate that rule. And so there is an advantage of, say, thinking of the AI that way as not simply being a utilitarian calculus that you abide by, but instead is, well, something which has a rule that is backed by a divine will, a divine authority. Yeah, that's advantageous. But what this Lewandowski guy is saying is the only authority he seems to be basing his willingness to elevate the AI to the Godhead on is that it's going to be super smart.
Okay, as in superhuman intelligence.
Yeah.
And kind of crosses that limit, that threshold towards superintelligent.
Yeah, and that's certainly one quality of God, and it certainly will be a strange relationship that we will have to that type of AI. But he seems just too willing to submit in a a religiously prostrating way to this super smart, super intelligence.
But I mean, even though you disagree with him, you
I recognize the value, but I don't know if that's what we want.
You do, at least in theory, seem to recognize the value.
Again, depending on what our goals are.
But again, if it's an evolutionary race between, let's say, different groups of people who are, submitting kind of to a regulatory entity, like a sovereign.
There might be some value to the humanistic standpoint by which we decide that it's our will that we want to maximize, right? Because that's been what we've increasingly done since the Enlightenment, and the West has done pretty well on the basis of that philosophy, right? That we put humans first, and what we respect the sanctity or the divinity of the individual rather than the group ends. That's done pretty well. It's the jury's out still for whether that'll continue to do well. We're in a demographic problem where we have a population catastrophe that the rest of the world doesn't seem to be having as much. So maybe that's not long-term a culturally workable idea or adaptive idea, but it's been adaptive so far in this particular environment. Who knows how the environment's going to change?
That's right. So I want to switch gears a little bit to another area that you studied, which is free will and belief in free will. So the question now about machines acquiring free will. This is maybe, I don't know if this is being super intelligent, superhuman intelligent is a prerequisite to acquiring free will or acquiring a belief that you have free will. Like, can you comment on that? Or do you think it's a uniquely human capacity?
Yeah, so with my research on free will, one of the things that I've tried to stay away with is exactly those kind of questions about whether something has free will or not, in particular whether humans have free will or not. And the reason for that is I feel like I'm out of my depth, right? So, when I was an undergrad, I was really interested in these topics of consciousness and free will, and I'm not a philosopher, and to have a grasp for the nuances and complexities of the compatibilist arguments and the real high level free will stuff requires not only a level of intelligence I don't have, but the amount of time to keep up on that literature, which I don't have time for.
I think you don't give yourself enough credit, but I think like a related question then is as you show, our belief in our own free will as humans is crucial to a lot of the social cooperation and our social behavior.
That's right.
And the question is, will machines that to which we are endowing a lot of our own autonomy, to drive us around and to make all kinds of decisions for us, including kind of sophisticated decisions that require a lot of expertise, like medical diagnosis decisions by physicians or parole decisions by judges, are at least being informed by machines, by algorithms. And the more we give away this autonomy or this actual free will, do you think this would diminish our own belief in our own free will and have kind of consequences on other things relating to our social interaction?
Yeah, so what I think is interesting is that I think we'll very easily start believing that the algorithms themselves have free will. And I think we already do this because we anthropomorphize robots very easily. And once we start doing that, once we start perceiving them to have free will, then that comes with all the praiseworthiness and blameworthiness that attributions of free will seem to carry with them. So somebody programs an AI to do, not even an AI, I mean, just a robot, like a program to do something. And we perceive that to, like, we get pissed off at our computers. We have tech rage because we think the computer is responsible for, it's like out to get us or something. And we know that's stupid. And it is stupid. But it's so natural for us to fall into that because we have a template of what an agent is. And if an agent seems to be doing something which is negatively affecting us, our first instinct is, well, they're blameworthy for that, and so I'm going to punch the screen or whatever. And as these,
at some point they're going to start punching back. That's the problem, right?
Yeah, well, then it's even easier to see them as having free will, right? Then they're obviously aggressing agents, and then we're the victims, and it plays into a moral template that we have, and then it's going to become a That's a problem.
But why is it a problem?
Well, okay, so you could say that these beliefs in free will and this blameworthiness is functional for us. It allows us to deter people from engaging in behaviors that we don't want them to do. And so maybe punching, if the computer or the AI is actually responsive to the punishments we dole out on the basis of our righteous, blameworthy anger, if it's effective at deterring that, then I guess that's using the same functional reasoning we use with humans, just for them. The thing is like, okay, so we have this, if you look at what is the evolutionary reason that we have these this temper, this rage response to when people aggress against us, it's at the proximate level, it's because you get pissed, right? And you fly into rage and you want them to suffer for what they're doing to you. So you have this real retributivist motivation. You want to extract pain for the pain that they've caused you. The real ultimate reason for that is consequentialist, which is if I have this reaction to them, it will deter future behavior that will negatively affect me. If I didn't do that, if I didn't have that rage reaction, I just let them walk all over me, then they would continue to do that in the future. So there's a consequentialist reason for this proximate emotion. And so that only makes sense to do if the other agent is actually responsive. So if you have an axe, right? So there's this story, I think this is in one of Pinker's books, where in the Middle Ages, if somebody got injured with an axe, they would put the axe on trial. And if the axe was found guilty, they would hurl it over the city walls. And then it's like, okay, good, you feel better. But then you pick up another axe. I
mean, I'm just thinking about the person outside the walls.
Well, yeah,
the fact the axe has
nobody cares about
on.
the people on the outside of the wall.
But they're outside the walls.
I hear you. That seems like dangerous. The whole thing seems ill-considered. But you pick up another axe, and it's like you haven't solved any problem there. It's like it wasn't that axe's fault that you got hurt. I mean, maybe it was a faulty axe, right? But you haven't learned that it was a faulty axe. You think you've done the trick because you've like banished the axe. You really showed him, and now everything's better. Everything's not better, right? So with the AI, if your rage doesn't actually change anything, then what's the point? Okay, maybe it makes you feel a little better.
So I guess there are two ways we could try and handle this situation, or one is we can educate people to try and like curb their urge to punish objects for mistakes, because objects don't
Or you can make the objects responsive.
You can make the objects, you can make the robots feel pain, right? Like, so do you think we should actually do that?
That seems like a hell of a thing to do, right?
Yeah.
So we're deliberately introducing more pain into the world.
Because I mean, pain is, in evolutionary terms, it serves a purpose, right? It allows you to regulate your behavior in response to things happening in the environment, and it also allows you to regulate the behavior of other people, and mutual regulation of behavior. Right, because we have this kind of mutually assured destruction. Yeah. That's why we're not punching each other at the moment.
Yeah.
Because if I punch you, you're gonna punch me back, so that wouldn't be good for me. Yeah. And I think, So do you think the same things will play out inevitably?
Well, it's interesting,
or will
right?
they always remain objects?
I mean, that's a whole can of worms, right? Because so there is a degree to which punishing artificial intelligences or punishing technology in general is unsatisfying from the direct proximate level, from that retributivist level. We sate our retributivist urge by actually causing suffering to somebody else. Right now, we have no real threat of suffering to AI, right? Or to any technology. Because even if we just pull the plug on them, even if we effectively kill them, well, they're not suffering when they're unplugged. They don't suffer with the expectation of being unplugged. So that comes into your idea of having to introduce suffering as a learning reinforcement technique.
But this, in principle, they could still happen, right? So when we, let's say there is an autonomous car that is doing, it's killing too many cyclists, right? Like this particular brand of autonomous car is just killing too many cyclists. And then, we just say, this program is faulty, let's eliminate it, let's install a different program. That's the most severe punishment. That's kind of obliterating a species, right?
Because they don't feel it, right? So what you're suggesting is that you actually have to introduce some sort of phenomenal. I mean, this is why it's such a radical idea. Is you have to somehow make the AI actually feel the subjective experience of pain.
You could anticipate this possibility of being destroyed.
I mean, it seems like the easier way is to just program just in your algorithm that says, well, this is a bad thing, that you should avoid this. Like you can tell it that it should avoid this in the case of this. So if this happens, that's bad. So that's going in the opposite direction of what your programming has got you to do, and so you can follow that, and that should be sufficient. It seems like the only reason to introduce the phenomenological experience of pain is if these cars actually have their own decision-making capabilities that go beyond that, the actual programming that you put in them.
But I mean, people do. I mean, there is a field within machine learning called reinforcement learning, where you would define, some metric for the AI to optimize, and then that enables you to then do things like reward and punishment in a more stylized approach, right? It's just a number, and it's trying to maximize that number. So I wouldn't call that a phenomenological pain experience necessarily, but I don't know what the difference is, at some.
The difference is enormous. I wouldn't call it anything close to a phenomenological experience of pain. I mean, that it sounds like that is fully sufficient.
Yep.
But nothing is suffering. Because nothing's
right. But then, we do have this feeling, we do suffer, and that has been adaptive for us, because it helps us avoid unexpected pains, painful experiences and things that would be detrimental to our survival. So why would the machines not acquire the same thing? Why would it? Or alternatively, why did we need to acquire it?
Yeah, so that's the question, right? So what is the evolutionary function of qualia, right? So what is the evolutionary function of actually having subjective experience?
Yep.
And my idea about that has always been that it's giving you an input of information. It's like a sense. It's like a sense. I mean, it is a sense, but it gives you having the real conscious taste of that qualia allows you to predict how other people are going to feel. And it's incredibly important for you to predict how other people are going to feel so that you can anticipate their behavior in the face of various actions that you could carry out yourself. If you can take the shortcut, which is to just program directly into the AI all that information, into the algorithm all that information, then it still doesn't seem necessary. Like, okay. I'm wondering, so what...
But then you'll have to know how to program it, right? So I wonder if at some point we're going to reach certain situations in which we don't know how to program it. And then we'll have to build in some sort of, self-correcting mechanism, which may require something that looks like, subjective experience of pain.
So long as, so why wouldn't those negative, so if it can overcome that idea of you putting in this negative numbers that are just going to dissuade it, I have to go towards positive numbers and away from negative numbers in your code. If it can overcome that, then you need something actually stronger with the sting of pain, perhaps, to motivate them. But if they're following the rules for the positive and negative numbers, then that should be sufficient.
True.
I mean, it's a good question, because if you look at the more basic organisms than us, so let's say cognitively or phenomenologically sophisticated organisms, they probably seem to do fine without the qualia, right? They probably don't have the elaborate subjective experience that we do. They have a stimulus response, which is almost exactly what is being programmed into these AIs.
That's right.
So at some point, it seems like from an evolutionary perspective, maybe it wasn't necessary, but it's the path that it took to make us functional, but higher level, cognitively sophisticated organisms.
Yep.
So I don't know if it was necessary, but maybe it's just one path to get people to do stuff which is in their interests.
So there was the last topic I wanted to discuss has to do with cultural evolution and social learning. You've worked with one of my favorite scientists in the world, probably the world's most prominent empirical anthropologist, Joseph Henrich, and who's promoting, one of the proponents of this idea that, we as a species are successful not because we're individually smart, Robinson Crusoe style, but because we're very good at social learning, and cumulative culture. So we're very good at observing one another, observing what works. You, Azim, are cooking your eggs in a very good manner that makes them very delicious, and I just observe this, and I just start copying you.
Yeah.
And then
so he's got this great quote in his new book. I love this, which is, "I see farther not because I stand on the shoulders of giants, but because I stand on the shoulders of a very large pyramid of hobbits," which is the human race. We haven't required geniuses in our history to learn from. We've just required a lot of people who've socially learned, and it has this cumulative process.
That's right, and I guess as a result we have this very effective strategies for doing all kinds of things that are and we don't even know why they work. We need science to help us discover. Model. Yes. Yeah. That's right. Fuck the causal model.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we need to, and that's kind of like basically that understanding the causal model is not necessary for you to take an idea or practice that is adaptive and that is helpful for you as an individual or as a species, and then using it and then even improving it. That somehow we're like we can be mindless copying machines and still become very sophisticated. Yeah. So this leads me to my question, which is now machines are kind of becoming storage devices for knowledge. I guess we've had this before already. We stored some of our knowledge in books and in other media, and now we're storing not only kind of factual knowledge in places like Wikipedia, but also procedural knowledge, and perceptual knowledge. Yeah. So now machines can perceive faces and classify them, in ways, in some cases, better than we can. And they can maybe also classify X-rays and make better predictions, about or better medical diagnosis than we can. So in a way, they become sort of storage of procedural knowledge that we can't even copy, or maybe sometimes we do copy. And my question is, are machines, are AIs becoming part of this social learning process? They're kind of actors in this process. And do you think of like examples where the behaviors of those machines starts then influencing us, and we start learning from them rather than the other way around? If the machines are all of a sudden switched off, will we navigate the way Google Map navigates as opposed to how humans would otherwise navigate? In that case, there's a feedback loop.
Yep. Yes, of course. Of course, we're being affected by the way that our machines learn. And there's definitely a feedback process by which we design our machines to do something, and then the consequence is that we now learn differently because of that. And you can see that in a lot of the information search psychology research about how we now approach information differently based on the fact that we have these remarkably efficient algorithms at finding information. Mm-hmm. So we remember things differently, and we perceive our own knowledge differently on the basis of Google, basically.
Yeah, the Google effect of memory, right?
Yeah.
Betsy Sparrow paper.
Yeah.
So, but then do you think that if we, so I think what the feedback loop is then that we would change our own search, information search behavior or whatnot. Maybe even, it could, this seems to be a little bit benign, but, I can imagine, for example, in dating, like if algorithms are deciding, what to suggest, and they're becoming, increasingly effective at matching, will this influence the way that we think about, romantic partners? And again, there's this question of like, what if we switch off the machines? Will we revert back to our original way of doing things? Or could we conceivably do things more algorithmically, even though the algorithms aren't doing these things anymore?
Sure, so you can imagine that the way that we've been influenced to do things based on the technology could push us into new directions, potentially more efficient directions or more adaptive directions of cultural processes that we wouldn't have been able to discover without them. And then once we're pushed on that track, our culture takes a different path, maybe a superior path. Alternatively, it could push us off adaptive paths into ways which, like, we may have missed our chance. Now, those might reappear based on various factors of cultural evolution. But I think the more tantalizing idea is that they could help us realize better ways of doing things that we wouldn't have otherwise realized.
So to kind of like try and make this kind of, a little, like, just to make sure I understand this point. So, that there are, let's say there are different ways of doing something, let's say, different ways of, what would be a good example of, dating, like finding romantic partners for matching. And then maybe we have this mechanism, right? This particular mechanism, using social networks and whatnot, and then that has a certain kind of efficiency, and then all of a sudden algorithms start doing things very differently, and then we through them we discover a new way of doing matching, and even if the algorithms are removed,
like think about it this way, right? So we have advice that's passed down from generation to generation about what to look for in our partners. We have a strong evolutionary sense that's pushing us to look for certain things, and then we have cultural information which is saying, giving us advice. Look for X, not Y. And sometimes we listen to the X, not Y cultural advice, and sometimes we just go with what our evolutionary urges drive us towards. The cultural information can sometimes be superior because what we're trying to maximize is not, say, the number of grandchildren, but some other factor which maybe the cultural information is better oriented to than the evolutionary urge was pushing us towards. And so what you could find is that the superior dating mechanism that's been discovered by the AI gives us new forms of advice. Oh, it actually turns out that the better thing for your dating success is to pay attention to these different characteristics. And now, when we explicitly recognize, which we would after a while if this is constantly having success, is, well, those are the characteristics that you should pay attention to, especially if you have this particular set of characteristics yourself. Then the AI goes away, and those pieces of advice stick around. Those patterns that we've learned are effective stick around. So you can think of it in terms of these sort of evolutionary peaks and valleys, right? So if you're on an evolutionary peak like this, and there's a higher peak over here, but you have to go through a valley to get there, you won't get there because you won't move to a place which is less adaptive than the one you're at to get to this thing that you have foresight for. But if the AI can bridge that, if the AI can find a way of saying, well,
all of a sudden you install the app and you jump.
That's right. Yep. And then you've made it to a place. Exactly. You've jumped the valley, and now you can get to the higher peak. So you could see that happening. That's the kind of best case scenario.
But as far as I know, I don't think it's been documented yet. But I think at least it seems to be plausible.
Sure.
Yep. Great. Well, on that note, it's been so much fun. I think we're running out of time. But
all right. That was great. That was fun.
That was really fun.